to our second press briefing. It's Tony Consul here in Geneva, Head of Communications for IATA. I'm with our Director General, Alexandre Juniac, as well as Brian Pearce, our Chief Economist. We'll start today with a brief presentation from Brian, outlining a revised analysis of the current estimates for revenue loss and the general situation of the industries. And then we'll turn it over to our Director General, Alexandre, to say a few remarks, and then we'll throw it open to questions and answers. Can I ask everyone to please mute their microphones for the duration of the call? And when we get to questions, we will take them via the chat function. Thank you very much for your consideration of that. With that, Brian, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Tony, and welcome everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. So if you'll just bear with me while that loads.
Okay, thanks, Brian. It's showing on my screen.
Excellent. Okay, good. What has changed since our last assessment of the impact of COVID-19 on the airline industry, particularly the airline industry's revenues? Well, in particular, we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of travel restrictions, which, in effect, are closing down international aviation. And you'll see a map here showing countries with severe travel restrictions, and that now covers 98% of passenger revenues. So the worst case scenario that we presented just 2 weeks ago, showing a $113 billion loss of passenger revenues in 2020, which was equivalent to 19% of what we would have expected, has been overtaken by events, and I'll share with you what our new estimates are in a minute. But firstly, it's not all bad news. We are seeing some signs of a turning point in the Chinese domestic market. As you can see here, certainly the March numbers, which is month 2 following the start of the crisis, is showing an improvement, and we're certainly getting those reports from the market. And indeed, if we look just hang on a second. Cute. Right, there we go. Yes, that's also confirmed by looking at passenger yields in the first 2 weeks of March in the Chinese domestic market. Chinese airlines had been having to discount seats by, 25% or so compared to a year ago in February. That's stabilizing. So that's a positive sign. However, for the industry as a whole, that is absolutely not what's happening. The spread of COVID-19 cases outside of the Asia-Pacific region is very dramatically hitting bookings, as well as obviously the closure of borders that we're seeing. This shows the numbers for the travel month of March. And the problem is that that is leading to imported cases of COVID-19 in those countries in Asia where there had been some success with the containment policy. And at one point, governments were thinking possibly of relaxing travel restrictions. But as you can see, those imported cases from Europe and from the Middle East have led once more to a fall in bookings for the Asia-Pacific region and for China international, though not for China domestic. And indeed is leading to this series of closures, travel restrictions in Asia-Pacific as well. And indeed, it's not just the fall in passenger numbers that airlines are facing. If you look at the yields that we've seen for March travel, airlines have been very sharply discounting. In previous crises, this has helped bring passengers back. It's not this time, and obviously the fall in yields is adding to the pressures on revenues. So, what sort of shape do we think will be the profile for travel markets? In all previous pandemics, we've seen the worst point 3 months after the crisis, and then 3 to 4 months after that, a return to pre-crisis levels. There were two differences between COVID-19 and past pandemics. The first is that this has spread globally, and we are seeing, community spread in many countries, which means even if there is a V shape to the recovery, it's an overlapping series which extends the crisis. But more importantly, we have never seen a pandemic coincide with the deep global recession, which is now expected. And that will, in our view, that will almost certainly mean that the travel recovery, once travel restrictions are lifted, which we hope will happen in the next few months, will delay recovery. And so it'll be a much more gradual upward slope. And to give you some idea of this is the latest March forecast from the economics firm Oxford Economics, which shows the depth of the global recession that is expected this year. It shows global GDP growth, and we've only ever seen a negative number for global GDP growth in the global financial crisis. This will lead to, obviously, job losses and weak consumer confidence, which will undoubtedly delay a return to travel. I should point out that the expectation amongst those economic forecasters is that we will see a strong 2021 economic recovery, and that's largely on the back of the massive fiscal stimulus that we're starting to see from governments. And if you look at the red line, you'll see that that selection of country stimulus packages that have been announced all range between 10 and 20% of annual GDP. So these are pretty massive numbers. Central banks are also extending credit lines and loan guarantees. The challenge, though, is that recovery is unlikely to come very quickly. And in the meantime, we're faced with an extraordinarily sharp downturn. And these are the assumptions around which we have based our revised forecasts for 2020 passenger traffic and airline revenues. And we've based, particularly if you look at the second quarter of 2020, in a region like Europe, we're expecting to see airline capacity down 90%. That's an effective closure, at least for a time during that second quarter. And similarly in the Middle East as well, and in varying degrees in other regions. In previous pandemics, you would have expected a rapid recovery in the third quarter. We think the recession will delay this, and so you've got some pretty large negative numbers still in the third quarter. And by the fourth quarter of this year, we still see the industry some 10% below where we would previously have expected. The consequence of that profile is that is these numbers for RPKs, or passenger numbers, for 2020 compared to last year. And we're expecting for the industry as a whole to see RPKs down, almost 40%. We think on average down by 38% in 2020. Previously, we had thought there'd be a fall of something like 16%. So this is actually more than double as a result of the travel restrictions that we've seen. And in terms of revenues, previously we had thought that the industry might see revenues down 113 billion, or 19%. What this suggests now is that we'll see a revenue loss compared to 2019 of over $250 billion, which is something like 44% down on 2019. 19 levels. Clearly this is a tremendous revenue shock. As I said earlier, economic forecasters are expecting fiscal stimulus and central bank stimulus to bring about a strong 2021 recovery. The challenge is that the scale of that sort of revenue recovery is hitting an industry where balance sheets are actually not very strong outside of the top 30 airlines. So there are lots of debt servicing and fixed obligations for airlines to have to pay. And in terms of the cash available, and this was a chart we released last week, the typical airline, the median airline, which is shown by the orange dot in the middle of those bars, typically had about 2 months worth of cash and cash equivalent at the start of the year. So the challenge is that before any recovery takes place, airlines may well run out of cash, which is why we're saying these are extraordinary times and are calling for government as well as supplier support to preserve the air transport industry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Brian. And next, I'd like to call on Alexandre Juniac to say a few words to describe and put into context what Brian has just presented.
Yes, thank you very much. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Brian, for this presentation. So you have painted a very difficult situation. The airlines are united to fight this unprecedented crisis. As you remember, on March the 5th, we thought that the pessimistic scenario was a revenue loss of $113 billion. Now you have seen just a few moments ago that we are forecasting a 38% fall in global demand. It means a $252 billion loss of passenger revenues, which is 44% down on 2019. So it's something which is the deepest crisis we have ever had in our industry. And the point is that we are, of course, unprecedentedly and severely hit by this financial and economic figures, but we are, as you know, as an industry, a vital part of the chain to first of all to supply medical equipment, medical personnel, drugs to fight the coronavirus. We are also a key element to maintain the supply chain for key industries, whether it's medical or fresh goods or electronics that supply all the equipments we are using or hundreds of people are using now to work from home. So that's it's a key element also, and I will talk about cargo in a few seconds to remind everyone of the importance of cargo in that respect. We have, and IATA has been asking governments to provide a lifeline of financial support. We have a liquidity crisis, which is coming at full speed, no revenues, and costs still are still on our P&L. So we desperately need some cash. I've seen some comments and remarks coming from some people saying, and so what, about the consequences for our industry. What we say is that the consequences are going beyond, the employment or the life of the 2.7 million people airlines employ. It goes even beyond the 65 million other jobs that directly or indirectly depend on the airline industry. It's a major hit on the global economy. It's a major hit on the way this economy is connected and the way it works. And so it will have a general and a global and a macroeconomic impact that is unvaluable in terms of impact. Fortunately, we have seen many governments, having a very open attitude and putting together some rescue packages in Singapore, China, Hong Kong, Australia, Brazil, New Zealand, Qatar, Colombia, Sweden, Denmark, EU, the US. It's a positive sign that governments pay attention to our situation and understand that the importance and the severity of this crisis. My message to government is that they have taken up this cause. Is to thank them for leading these policy to rescue this industry. But we must keep watching the situation because we may need governments even more. And my second message to government is to speed up. We clearly need the massive action very quickly, urgently. There are also several levers that only governments may pull to help us. The direct financial support, loans, loan guarantees, support from the corporate bond market by either government or central banks, tax relief, social charges relief. But it has to be quick. Just one word about cargo, because it's a critical element of this industry and of the whole economy. When government put restriction on passenger flights, sometimes it restricts as a consequence some cargo flights or some cargo operations. And secondly, when you put a restriction on passenger, and when the passenger aircrafts are grounded, the belly capacity, the cargo capacity are significantly reduced because a lot of cargo is transported in our bellies. So we ask government to maintain and even to facilitate the cargo traffic, the freight traffic. It's a key issue. And perhaps I would like to share with you some examples about the difficulties we are facing in this multiple restriction period. For instance, one airline ran a repatriation flight for its nationals to a country in Asia. On the return operation, the airline wants to make a stop in a third country to pick up relief supplies, but valuable time is being wasted waiting for approval of traffic rights. So that's the point on which we ask government to work. We have cargo crew that are caught up in quarantine measures that are designed for commercial passengers. And in some cases, they are not being allowed to position on commercial flights. So we think that these measures, quarantine measures, should be adapted to the cargo aircraft, the cargo crews. We have our staff that has intervened in Somalia and Djibouti, where cargo flights fell under the same temporary flight ban as passenger aircraft. So we have to preserve and to facilitate cargo operations. They are vital. So, for instance, by exempting crew from quarantine restrictions, by expediting paperwork for special operations, by doing everything possible to reduce and eliminate costs and charges for cargo. That's a key point. And we are pushing government and to take these measures to facilitate and to lift any restriction on the cargo traffic. So, as a summary, two messages: the crisis has deepened, revenue losses could reach $252 billion this year, and we need governments to act fast with financial relief to avoid the liquidity crisis and that we run out of cash, and that almost half of the companies die in the coming weeks. Second point, second message, cargo operations are vital. Governments need to do all they can to facilitate this industry that is scrambling to meet demand. So we are now working hard to survive. We need government help. We need government to bridge us to the point where we can start to recover. Frankly, we have the people, the equipment, the experience, but we need money. We don't have enough money to bridge the gap. That's the conclusion. I look forward to your question, and I hope we'll have a lot of questions.
Great. Thank you very much, Alexandre. It's Tony here again. We'll take questions in the chat function, as I mentioned before. Thank you for keeping your microphones on mute. We had one question that came in early, which was, what kind of financial help are we asking for? And in asking for that, is there a danger that we're trying to preserve some non-viable players in the industry?
We are aiming at having, we are proposing to governments a complete set of measures, credit lines, cash injection, loans, guarantees on credit, by refinancing through buying back bonds that are issued by the banks which are financing the airline. So it's a complete set of measures, of financial measures. And we are proposing that to each government for each airline. So it's a tailored approach that is designed to fit with the situation, the individual situation of the airline and of the country. So taking into account the financial situation, the ownership, the potential instruments that the government is ready, to implement. So it's a tailored approach in a complete set of financial measures that we are proposing to each country.
Okay, thank you, Alexandre. We have another question asking if the dire financial situation will actually perhaps promote the consolidation and the departure of weaker carriers.
If the situation continues, we will have some companies that will go bankrupt. So at the end, there will be a consolidation because some of them will be bought by others. You will see some mergers or some regroupments. So there will be potentially a consolidation following the crisis.
Okay. A question on cargo. Do we have any figures on the impact there?
No.
Yeah.
Alexandre, shall I answer that one? We're working on that. It's not as easy to assess the impact. What we do know is that freighters are in high demand. And perhaps Alexandre would say a little bit more about this, supplying essential medicines, but also, keeping the world working still. And we're starting to see China return to work. But obviously, half of air cargo was shipped in the bellies of the passenger fleet, which, is largely grounded. But we are working on that, and we'll come out with some analysis in the near future.
There are more and more full freighters that are now used by airlines. So they are using full freighter capacity, and some of them are also using passenger aircraft to transport goods as cargo. So the cargo part of the business is under significant pressure.
Okay. We have a question asking about flight restrictions. Are we expecting more flight restrictions in the U.S. and elsewhere?
Up to now, for the past 3 to 4 weeks, the situation has gone through a general closure of borders. Let's sum up the situation like this: every day we see restriction, we see closure. So at one point there will be nothing more to close, but we are not probably at the end of any restriction. You see still countries, especially in the first slide that Brian has displayed. There are some countries that are still open and that could, impose further restriction. But as you know, it's a sovereign decision. We have unfortunately no influence on that.
Okay, a question about airlines and potential for collapse. How many airlines do we see that as potentially happening to, and what regions specifically are most in danger?
Brian, do you want to answer?
Sure. Those of you who participated in an earlier call will maybe recall a slide we showed which indicated that the improvement in profitability that we've seen in the airline industry in the past 5 to 10 years has been largely driven by about 30 airlines. So there's a very large number of airlines, hundreds, that are more or less breaking even or indeed making losses. So those airlines are very fragile in the face of this sort of cash flow shock. Just looking at the moment in terms of, you'll see from the slides in terms of the scenario, Europe is a focus of extraordinary pressure just at the moment with the border closures and the fact that we'd expect to see capacity down 90% or more during the second quarter. So I would say that clearly airlines in that region are most at risk at the moment.
Okay. Thank you, Brian. On that, there are I see several questions asking for data. We will be posting Brian's presentation after this call, and we'll also be sending out a release with some figures highlighted. So you'll get all the data there. A question on cargo again. Could airlines buckle under financial pressure and not be able to perform the vital cargo functions that they're doing now?
It could happen, but if they mobilize some of their passenger aircraft, they will be able, to do the job. Okay. Plus, you have the specialized cargo companies that can dedicate some of their capacity to that market. So normally we have the capacity to do it.
Okay. A question on the request for relief funds. If airlines are not flying, what are they going to use the relief money for?
That's a strange question, because if they have a relief money, it's because they have to pay costs that are still running. It's not because you are not flying that you don't have cost. You pay your employees, you pay for the lease of the aircraft, you pay for the equipment, for the amortization of your investment. But there are a lot of unavoidable costs that you have to pay for. So that's will be the use of the money to cover the costs.
Yep. Great, thank you. Next question is, what's the impact of lower jet fuel prices, and is that providing any alleviation?
Brian, do you want to give the figure, perhaps?
Sure, yes. Before the crisis, we saw, if I talk in terms of oil prices, Brent crude was something like, we were expecting Brent crude to be $63 a barrel this year. Now it's down in the 30s. We've seen more than a $20 a barrel fall in the price of oil and jet fuel. In a full year, if the industry was flying, that would lower costs by about $40 or $45 billion, which is obviously a substantial sum. But given a revenue loss of four times that, it really
a fast-growing crisis.
Okay, if I could ask the person who has unmuted their microphone to please mute again, that would be much appreciated. Hello.
So let me just carry on. So I think the fall in fuel prices at the moment is relatively small given the revenue shock, and because the problem today is that the industry has had to close operations in many markets. It's rather irrelevant.
Okay. Once again, if I could ask the person who's unmuted to please mute their mic. In the meantime, I'll try and speak over the noise. A question on the IATA AGM. Have we made a decision on continuing with the AGM in June, or will that be postponed or cancelled?
Decision made in the coming days. And,
okay.
And communicated immediately.
Okay, thank you. A question on the Chinese market. How quickly do we see the recovery, and what are the general indications?
The general indication is that we are seeing the beginning of the recovery of the domestic market, not the international, but the domestic market. The recovery starts with the passenger demand that is increasing. The yield is slightly better than it was last month, so in the last 2 weeks of February. So the traffic is coming back slowly. And the load factor is for the domestic market is around 60%. So things are improving, but slowly, and should normally improve following the lift of the restrictions and on the confinement that the Chinese authority have decided, especially as far as we understand in Wuhan. But Brian, perhaps you want to comment further.
I think you've summed it up, Alexandre. I mean, I think we're as you say, with the containment success in China, we are starting to see an increase in the number of flights. Passengers are travelling domestically. As Alexandre said, load factors are up to around about 60%, and China's slowly going back to work. So that's an encouraging sign, but that's not improving the international situation. And because of all the imported cases of COVID-19, because of the spread outside, we're not seeing any improvements at all in international markets to China.
Okay, thank you, Brian. A question on the conversation about relief measures being attached to specific requirements. For example, fuel-efficient or cleaner airplanes. And the question specifically is, could governments demand the grounding of dirty aircraft as a condition for the bailout?
For us, we are asking for this rescue package with the minimal condition and especially with the maximum speed. Our worries is that, if you put conditions and restrictions and whatever requirements, it would, lengthen the process. And so the cash will not be injected at the right time. And so we'll run out of cash, we'll go bankrupt, and this industry will disappear. So we can understand that there are requirements. We just ask that they are simple, not too complicated to fulfill, and not too strict. Especially, I would say that linking all money injection with fuel efficient aircraft is particularly difficult to implement in this crisis situation. We are in an emergency situation. It's no time for refinements. I'm sorry for that. We need a full speed, massive rescue package now.
Okay. Another question. Is there enough space for aircraft to be parked on the ground, and is that creating any issues?
Of course, it creates issues because you have to convert, and we see that in many airports. You have to convert runway, to close runways, and to convert them into parking. But that's usually a decision that and the planification and the planning that is done in conjunction between the airports and the airlines. Normally, we should have enough, parking positions using, closed runways or remaining parking spaces. I do not say that everywhere it will be easy, but it should work.
Okay. We have a question saying there were airlines that were loss-making before the crisis, and wouldn't it be better to let them go bankrupt? Recalling that even in the financial crisis, not all banks were saved, and there was a bit of a shakeout.
Nobody is saying that the rescue package and the money that could be injected should save everybody at any cost for any purpose, whatever the situation is. We have an emergency situation. We need some cash to rescue the whole industry. Now, for the weakest airlines of our industry or those who were already in a difficult situation, it will not solve structurally their problem. So it will perhaps delay a bit or postpone, the structural solutions or remedies that they will have to implement. But for the moment, please focus on what the key point of the emergency is injecting cash for everybody. And then we will deal with, the industry and the market, will deal with those who are the weakest in the industry. Perhaps, Brian, you want to comment further on that?
Well, only to say that this liquidity crisis is affecting the strong as well as the weak, which is why the call is for a general provision of liquidity, of cash by central banks and government. I think the priority is to make sure that the industry is in fit enough condition to serve the recovery period. Because air transport is so important for the modern economy in transporting goods and linking up supply chains.
Yeah. I think the point there is, do we want that to be an orderly process or a disorderly process in the middle of a crisis?
But we have no time to think about, organizing precisely case by case a very nice rescue plan. So we have a few weeks to act. So these plans have to be put together and implemented quickly. And frankly, for those who are the weakest and who perhaps could have or should have already disappeared, I think the market will do the job in the future. But for the moment, we have to act and quickly.
Okay, thank you.
Perhaps in a little disorder. That's.
A question about Mexico. The government there has ruled out financial relief. How do we see the condition or the situation in Mexico and the ability of the Mexican carriers to deal with that?
Brian, you want to answer? Or you...
It's going to be a challenge. I think Latin America has perhaps been a region that has suffered later than most, but certainly with the damage being done to the U.S. economy, that certainly affects the Mexican airlines and Mexican businesses tremendously. So we would certainly see pressure. I mean, not all airlines are in the same position. Some airlines have got substantial cash reserves. They have credit lines to banks. They have unencumbered assets against which they can borrow. But unfortunately, that's the few. The crisis is such that many airlines can't access that, or that's not sufficient. So I think the situation in Mexico, is worrying.
Yeah. In addition, I would like to add that it's a political choice from the Mexican government to help or not to help. We strongly advocate, in favor of helping, the Mexican airline industry, because when you look at Mexico and the way the economy of Mexico is working, they rely, as many countries, on the airline sector. not only to mention the importance of tourism in this country, but also, the fact that they are supplying a lot of the industrial equipment for the U.S. economy, with factories that are based in Mexico for the U.S. industry. So it's a bit surprising, to see that there is nothing done to support the airline industry in this country, which is so critical.
Okay. Question about cargo again. It's been weak for some time. How does that impact our sort of projections for the cargo sector?
Well, it should have a positive impact on the cargo sector after a month and month of decline. But it's a bit early now to have a precise view. Except Brian, if you have updated the projection, but I suppose it's too early to have a precise impact or global impact on the cargo at this stage.
It is. Before the COVID crisis, we had the trade war crisis for air cargo, and the truce that we saw between the US and Japan was leading to some optimism. But obviously, then we were hit by the COVID crisis. As Alexandre has said, the freighter part of the industry, is in great demand at the moment. I think that the challenge is going to come, though, with the recession, the economic recession that is likely to be the immediate consequence of all we see happening, because air cargo is still vital for the world economy, but I think demand will be weak.
Okay. We have a question again about relief measures. The discussion seems to be advancing in developed countries like the United States, Europe, etc. But what about support for airlines in emerging markets? And do these markets have the financial means to fund the relief that the industry needs?
It will be more difficult, for the states, which have a limited budgetary means or limited, financial leverage on the financial market, to issue bond or to be able to have a refinancing through their central bank. So perhaps with this country, we will have to see whether we can push for a package coming from the international institution, whether it's a World Bank or the IMF or a regional development bank. That could be something that could be helpful. But obviously, the less access to financial market or the less powerful, budgetary speaking, the state is, the more difficult it could be to support its airline or the airline industry locally.
Okay. Probably a question for Brian. Are we tracking job losses, and do we have any estimates?
We are seeing airlines having to cut workforces, in a desperate attempt to save cost in the face of this huge revenue shock. So clearly jobs are being lost. We know that the airlines employ something like 2.7 million jobs. At this stage, we're not sure how many of those jobs are lost, and I'd emphasize that it's more than just the employees of the airlines, because the industry support, for every one job in the airline industry, the industry supports 24 jobs across the wider economy, a total of 65 million. So there's quite a lot tied in with the economic success or otherwise of the air transport sector.
Okay, thank you. Previously, we'd called for 200 billion in state aid. With these revised estimates of revenue losses, does that change?
It's a good question, but the state aid, it was a rough valuation, and it was not covering the same scope as the loss of revenues. The state aid covers cash injection, loans, credit guarantees, etc. So it's the reason why the figure is different. But in terms of the global financial package that the industry need from government, it's in the area of 200 million, perhaps slightly more, 200 billion, sorry. slightly more than the 250 million, which is a loss of revenues. We don't ask for strict compensation of the loss of revenues. It has no financial sense. But perhaps you would like to comment on that, Brian, as well?
Well, only that I think it's as Alexandre said, it was a broad estimate. If the industry is not earning any revenues, what it needs to do is to cover its fixed costs, those costs that are unavoidable, which are probably in that sort of ballpark. So I don't think that needs changing at this stage. I think the general point is that governments need to look to their local carriers to ensure that the air transport system is preserved to the point that it can help generate the recovery when that comes.
Okay. A question on fixed cost. What is the largest fixed cost that airlines need to deal with in this crisis?
It is probably the labor cost when they keep, their employees on their payrolls, which is not the case everywhere because you have the mechanism of the partial unemployment or technical unemployment, chômage technique or chômage partiel, which is in place in various countries, particularly in Europe. But it's the labor cost and probably the aircraft cost.
Okay. A question on environment. The environment lobby is probably happy that the airline emissions have gone down as a result of this crisis. What do you say to that?
We say that the environment remain a key issue for the airline industry as it is for others. That it has not, gone away from our priorities. It has just we are just saying we must solve first of all the financial and economic crisis, and then when we will recover and come back to normal waters, we will continue to consider environment and reducing CO2 emission and reducing noise and all the environment, objectives and targets as key priorities. But in terms of hierarchy of priorities for the moment and in the short run, we have to focus on financial and economics.
Okay. A question on regulation. Do you think the industry should be re-regulated as part of state aid?
So there is no need for a re-regulation. It is not, because this industry is not in this situation because of a lack of regulation. Frankly, it's completely disconnected. We are in this situation because there is a sanitary crisis, major one, a pandemic, and that triggers closure of borders and restriction of travels, and so a fantastic drop in the passenger demand. So it has nothing to do with regulation. So there is no need for or deregulation or further regulation. This industry needs to be smartly regulated. We have a concept of smart regulation that has to be implemented or generalized. That's all. It's nothing to do with regulation, frankly.
Okay. Another question on the broader implications of this. We often talk about how aviation has a broad role in the economy. Here we're talking about loss of revenue for airlines, but do we have a broader calculation of what losing the airline industry would do to the broader economy?
Brian, we have some estimates, but it's not easy to. They're not always easy, but we have some estimate on that.
Yeah, I mean every $1 of airline revenue typically generates $3.8 of GDP in the wider economy. So, this is an industry because it's our really reason for being is to connect cities and generate trade and investment and many of the building blocks of economic development. 65 million people are employed around the world, supported by aviation. So the loss aviation services, is particularly critical for modern businesses and modern supply chains. And it is important when we're thinking of the future recovery. That's going to depend on the flow of goods as well as tourists. So governments, I think, will need to make sure that air transport services are preserved to help generate that recovery.
Okay. Do we have an estimate for profit this year?
No. We are going to be having a look at that. I think perhaps what's of most concern at the moment to us is the rate of cash burn in the industry because of those fixed costs and the loss of revenues, and that will probably be the thing that we're working on most immediately.
Okay. Previously, we spoke about a V-shaped recovery. Do we still see it as a V, or is it more of a U or a W or something else?
If I could answer that, Alexandre. The V-shaped recoveries came with previous pandemics, partly because there was no recession. Today, we're talking about the travel restrictions and the lockdowns really leading to a serious economic downturn globally. That, I think, is the resulting job losses, the loss of consumer confidence is undoubtedly going to delay the return of passengers. And so we have built that into our new forecast. So you'll see the third quarter figures are a much slower recovery. So yes, I guess it is more of a U shape than a V shape.
Okay. A question on the long-term trends. Do you think this crisis could impact the long-term trajectory of the industry's growth?
I guess it's hard to be absolutely clear at this in the depth of the crisis. It will certainly be a different shaped industry when we come out. But I think in terms of air travel demand, I think all the lessons of the past have shown that it's very robust, and we have seen a rebound. Even after global recessions and after pandemics, and so I think the trends in terms of demand, the desire and need for people in the emerging markets in particular to fly and for their businesses to be connected by air transport services will continue. I think the question is how quickly we get back to those previous trends. And in a large part, that depends on the support governments will give both to airlines and the broader economy.
Okay, a question on ticket prices. Going forward, we've seen some airlines try market stipulation with cheaper ticket prices. Do we understand what the evolution of ticket prices might be? And selling cheap tickets, does that give the right signal in the current situation?
We have seen a decline in the yield and on the ticket price, but that was mainly triggered by the fall in demand. Normally, if we recover, the recovery will go along with, I think, limited increase in ticket prices, even a flat curve or even a declining curve in ticket prices, probably.
Okay, we'll try and get in two more questions before we hit the hour mark. First one is, are airlines happy to accept loans which need to be paid back rather than grants?
It depends on the financial situation of each airline, but of course, if we have loans, we'll repay them as normal business. So there is no. And if there are grants, I'm not sure that we'll see a lot of grants. We can say capital injection, equity injection that is not refundable. But then the counterpart is the evolution of the ownership.
Okay. And last question is, any comment on the discussion in the U.S. of tying emissions targets to potential financial relief?
The only comment we make is act fast. Please resolve any dispute. Put together the package for the industry and implement it. Urgency is key.
Great. We have time for one last question then. A repeat of something we heard earlier, but just to be clear, are we re-estimating the 200 billion figure we discussed last week?
No, it was an order of magnitude. It is in this order of magnitude. The cash injection for the industry by any means, grants, loans, guarantees, whatever, equity injection is the order of magnitude is 200 billion US dollars.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we've gotten through pretty much all of the questions that we had coming in. So thank you all very much. If there are other questions, please don't hesitate to write to us at corpcoms@iata.org. We'll sort through those as quickly as we can. Again, we will try and do these briefings on a weekly basis, so we'll be available again next week. In the interim, if you have questions, we're here to help. Thank you all very much.